Hi, it's Todd Gallagher here. I'm with Gavin Hardy, landscape architect. Gavin is a multi-award winning landscape architect. He's got over 20 years of experience and he's the owner and principal of Gavin Hardy Designs. So Gavin's worked on a number of Brisbane projects, including green space initiatives, such as the 2016 National AILA award-winning Kurupa Green Space Strategy. Gavin's had a lot to do with Northey Street City Farm over the years and Main Street Boulevard. At the end of 2020, Gavin was thrilled to learn that he's a recipient of the prestigious Churchill Fellowship. So the aim of the Churchill Fellowship is to provide an opportunity to Australians to travel overseas to conduct research in their chosen field. Gavin will be studying two special types of green space during his overseas research: community-based food forests and community orchards. Now today, Gavin will be discussing urban food production, an area which has developed over 2 decades of experience designing, making and researching community food systems within the urban context. Thanks very much for joining us today, Gavin. What are community food systems?
Okay, thanks Todd, and thanks everyone for listening in. So I guess to start off with, I might just do a little bit of a screen share. Okay, so a good place to start with looking at community food systems is to think about three broad categories in the public sphere, and then also think about the private sphere. So there's three broad categories in the public sphere, and they are allotment gardens, and I'll show some imagery of that in a minute, community orchards and community food forests. Now they're three very broad categories, and there's lots of nuances and subtleties between the three of them, lots of overlaps. Some places have all three of those types of typologies in them. Others have various blends and mixes. A good place to start when looking into this area is some work that American landscape architect April Phillips has done, and she published a book a few years ago called Designing Urban Agriculture. And I would recommend that book just as a bit of a primer to understand what we're talking about with community food systems as a subset of urban agriculture. So the other aspect of urban agriculture is producing food on private lots, not so much public lots. And that's a whole other area of work and research that I'm not really focusing on with my work. My work really focuses on the public sphere. So when we're looking at the three broad types of community-based food systems, I talked a little bit there about allotment gardens. So here's a classic allotment garden. If you look beyond the words on your screen, you'll see allotments. So plots of small plots of land that are rented out typically to members of the local community to grow vegetables, flowers and herbs. Typically people are growing annual vegetables, plants that only grow for a year or maybe two, and then they're ploughing that all in and growing another crop for the next season. So annual vegetable allotments are a pretty common pattern in community gardening all around the world. So another type of garden, and if I could just get rid of that, then I'll be able to call up. Okay, so community orchards. So community orchards are typically what I would define as orderly grows of fruit and nut trees on pasture. So that's an orchard in a traditional sense. You will have pasture grasses that aren't mowed. They might be grazed by livestock in Europe, where many orchards evolved. They would be grazed by sheep. In the modern context, we might be mowing underneath those orchard trees. And as you can see, they're lovely places to be in. And I'll talk a little bit more about the benefits of these places. So that's a community orchard in Canada, in Vancouver.
Yeah, it looks really lush and yeah, nice amount of amenity.
Beautiful place. Yeah. Here's another example. This one's in the UK, and it's got some remnant trees from a former commercial orchard. And I think if I was to scroll down, I might get some information about it. Maybe not, but there's the people involved with this. Oh, here we go, orchard history. So this is quite an old orchard that was put in a long time ago by previous generations. And, you know, in places in the old world, have this lovely legacy of old orchards that people these days have really come to value as places for recreation and enjoyment, and also, you know, food, obviously. So this one here is a very old orchard which has now been incorporated into a public park. And in England, typically we have pear and apple trees. The English are very keen on their apples. There's a lot of culture around that. So that's the second sort of broad category, community orchards. And then a system that I'm really interested in, and that's let me just leave that there, community food forests. So community food forests have been around for a very long time. They're believed to be one of the first forms of agriculture. And I'll talk in a lot more detail about what food forests are, but this one here is in Morocco, and it's believed to have been in continuous use for at least a few centuries and possibly a couple of millennia. And if I scroll to the top of this article about this one in Morocco, and it's one of the biggest ones in the world, it's about 65 hectares in size.
Wow.
It's a system that's got multiple layers. It's got this particular system is dominated by date palms, with olives below and other sort of mid-story trees that are edible shrubbery, ground covers, in this case, and herbage, in this case, broad beans, and other plants. And that's a very old system, perhaps an example of a newer system.
So it really is about those multiple layer assemblages. Is that how they
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. Yeah, I'll talk a bit more about that. I've just lost, let's see if I can screen share again there. Actually, I'll come back to that diagram a little bit later. There's variations on the theme of food forestry. There's ethno-medicinal forests, which are typical. A bit of research that's been done in India and Southeast Asia and other developing countries is growing medicinal food plants in a forestry type system for the local people to be able to use. In our own country, another variation on the theme is the bush tucker garden. So using local indigenous plants to grow bush foods. And that's one that's been developing in this country for a few decades now. Okay, so that's sort of it as a broader overview. The three broad types of community food systems.
Thanks for that. So as landscape architects, we're obviously designing, you know, for both social amenity and also for, you know, creating holistic environmental systems. Gavin, could you talk about the benefits of the places created through these systems? of food, urban food systems?
Yeah, love to. So often we talk about with community food systems, the first thing people think about is the amount of food that they produce. Okay, so the yields, we might talk about the idea of food as yielding a product for us. Well, that's just one particular benefit that people might get out of it. And depending on where you live, if you're living in the rich, affluent West, where you can go down to your local supermarket and get copious amounts of food, fairly readily available at ridiculously low cost. Yield might not be such a strong driver for doing this sort of work. If you live in a developing country where food is scarce and hard to get, then yield becomes more important. And yield is just one, yield of food product and fibre as well, is just one particular benefit. So lots of other benefits. So let me have a little bit of a chat about that. So some of the work that I've been doing and looking at other people's research is how urban kids benefit from these places. My observation is that kids love playing in these places. They're a place of adventure and a place for nature play. You know, nature play has been a sort of buzz phrase for a few years now. That I know that many landscape architects are interested in that concept. Kids love to come into these places. They're not quite fully wild, but they're not quite fully urban. They're sort of an in-between space, a place where they can come in and maybe observe local wildlife, insects, birds, frogs, that sort of thing. It's a place, if they're big enough places, kids come into these spots and they can ramble and quest independently by themselves, you know, little gangs of little kids. It's a great way for kids to be introduced in a safe way to independent play. And I'm old enough to remember a time when I was a child and I could play in the remnant bushland of my local suburb before that remnant bushland got converted into more housing. I guess these days kids don't have access to that. A lot of urban children don't. But these sort of community food forests, community orchard systems allow children to get that benefit. Other benefits that we see a lot are coming out is people learning new skills. So there's some overseas programs where people can do a certificate in community orcharding. You know, can learn new life skills, how to look after fruit trees, but also potential vocational skills in these locations. And also reviving old traditions. So learning how to press for apple cider is a big revival of that stuff in Europe and North America, and all the traditions that come with that as well. So it's another great benefit, and of course the social aspect, bringing people together so that they can sort of avoid these problems that we're getting in society with isolation and loneliness. A lot of research indicate that community gardens, community food systems help alleviate that problem. And then I guess for landscape architects, the thing I'm really particularly interested in is what I would call place connection, how people connect to their places, how people connect to the land, indeed develop a love of their land and a pride in their place. And I think my observation, my own personal experience and experience of other researchers is that community orchards, food forest community gardens help people develop a sense of place, a place connection. So yeah, there's multiple benefits, and then of course, you know, I've just talked about the human dimension. There's all the environmental service dimension of these places in terms of, you know, water conservation, soil conservation, biodiversity biodiversity benefits. There's so many good things about these systems. I'm so passionate about this stuff, I could be talking about it to you guys for the next 2 hours, but I'm sure we don't have that sort of time.
No, we'd love that.
Yeah.
So I guess we did touch on what defines community food forests or food forests in general before, and sort of talked about assemblages and layering. Could you give us some more detail on how they're comprised? What we might look for in a typical example?
Absolutely. So I'll go back to a share screen here. If I go back up the top, it's going to let me do that. Let's have a look. Okay, so this is an Italian website for a food forest in Parma, in Italy, the Picasso food forest. But it's got a great little diagram here that sort of explains the thing quite well. So when we think of the structure or patterning of a typical forest, it has different vertical layers or stories. So you think of a forest having an upper story, the really big, tall canopy trees. You might have a mid-story of intermediate-sized tree, and then a shrub layer, a herbaceous layer, a root crop layer or a rhizosphere, and ground cover crops and climbers and vines. And we see that pattern in forests all around the world. And they're recognised as the most one of the most biologically productive systems on Earth, producing a lot of biomass. So a food forest tries to repeat that pattern, but mainly using edible plants and support species. So let me just stop sharing, and then I need to reshare, go into another site. Let's see if we can open this one. So, can you see that, Todd?
Yeah, yep.
Yep, it's coming up. So this is some work by an American landscape architect, Lincoln Smith, who has a business called Forestry. And Lincoln's an interesting guy because he's pivoted his whole business towards creating forest gardens in the United States. And so if I just read out this statement here, so on the right-hand side, forest gardens are multi-layered agricultural plantings modelled on forests. They intermix crops with other plants that improve fertility and attract beneficial organisms. Forest gardens produce abundant food and supplies for people while improving water quality and wildlife habitat. These plantings can be large enough to support a community or small enough to fit in your own backyard. Creating a food forest is an important way for people to help the environment and leave a legacy for future generations. There's no other truly sustainable agriculture for the forested ecosystems of the world. So they are a very sustainable system. Once they're established, they tend to look after themselves. Some writers think that they are the most highest yielding agricultural system ever invented in terms of the amount of inputs you need to put into it for the amount of food you get out of it. You think about modern industrial agriculture, we get a lot of yield out of that system, but we put a heck of a lot of input into it to get it to yield the amount of food that we get. These are far more sustainable systems, and as I said, they've been around for a very long time. So yeah, have a look at Lincoln's website. He's in some ways he's a unique forest garden designer because he's a landscape architect like myself. And he's done some really, really great illustrations of how a forest garden might work and lends that sort of landscape architect's eye to the system as well. So have a look at his stuff, really lovely illustrations.
Yeah, some really, really lush graphics there, isn't there?
Yeah, nice stuff. Just got to stop sharing this screen. And then I'm going to reshare. as I said, food forests have been providing food for people for a very long time, and a lot of research is focused on developing countries that people have more difficult access to food. At this point in time, in the future, my prediction is that that's going to happen in the West as well. And so a big focus, a lot of research is about food and nutrition. But as landscape architects, I think we have a lot more to add to the debate around the concept of place and how, particularly people in the affluent West, can benefit from these places by forming a connection with their local places. So a little bit more of a screen share. If you want to take a deeper dive into this work, let's see if we can get this to come up. Yeah, have a look at, there's a whole lot of really good papers out there, but this one here is a very good edition of Urban Forestry and Urban Greening Journal, a whole edition in 2019 just devoted to urban food forestry.
Wow.
So recommend having a look at that again as an overview of what this idea is about. The United Nations have said that urban food forestry is one of the key strategies for helping people in the future get access to fresh food, and it's one of their sort of identified one of their goals for delivering fresh food. I can't quite remember where it all sits, but if you pull up this particular journal edition, you'll find it in there. You just have to read the whole thing to find it, that's all. I'll stop sharing that and I'll reshare again. Let me find it. Oh, I don't know if it's here anymore. Okay, I'm going to see if this works. Another very good overview is this paper by Clark and Nicholas in 2013. I recommend just have a read of that. It's a journal article in Landscape Ecology journal.
We'll get Gavin to send through these links, and we'll put them as some live links on Blackboard, so you can refer to these articles and papers.
Yeah, great idea. And it's a sort of overview stuff. There's lots of work out there at the moment. Yeah, so that's sort of a slightly deeper dive into food forestry. The other thing to say about food forestry, sort of a framework about thinking about it, is it's a part of agroforestry or agricultural forestry. So agroforestry has lots of different strands and fields, delves into growing timber. In fact, in Australia, I see when I hear people talk about agroforestry, that's sort of the thing that industry sort of visualises agroforestry to be, is growing timber on farms, farm forestry. Okay, there's a whole lot of other areas of agroforestry. So food forestry is one of it. Forest gardening is another term you'll hear. Yeah, so lots of different ways of looking at it. But agroforestry is sort of the overarching framework for looking at food forestry. The other thing to say about this is that food forestry has been around, mainly evolved in the tropics and subtropics. And so there's some evidence, for example, that pre-Columbian societies in South America were doing food forestry for a very long time, and that supported their very big populations in the Amazon Valley.
And this is that they talk of syntropic farming. Is that sort of falling?
Yeah, syntropic farming. Okay, so that's another bit of the lingo as well. Syntropic farming, analog forestry. There's another one which Sri Lankans use that word. It's an analog You know, it's an analogue to a tree forest, an analogue forest. Yeah, South India. I guess that's where the research really began in the 1970s. The sort of scientific inquiry into food forestry sort of began in the 70s. People like P.K. Nair. P.K. Nair is sort of regarded in my mind, as sort of the father of modern agroforestry, and he was a native of Kerala in South India, and he was looking at multi-story tree cropping systems that are the tradition in Kerala, and looking at how those systems worked and trying to quantify, put some science around what he was seeing. So, yeah, tropical parts of the world have been doing this stuff for a long time, but it's also seems to be evolving the last few decades as well in the temperate part of the world, and in temperate climes tends to be more called forest gardening. You might see that word crop up, or in the temperate world. Sometimes not so much forest gardening, but woodlot gardening, or woodland gardening, I should say, woodland gardening. So woodlands are tree areas that aren't as dense as forests. So they allow more light to hit the ground. In a temperate zone, you don't want to be fully covered over with canopy trees because not enough light hits the ground, so you can't grow food at the lower layers. So we're looking a lot in these systems at how much sunlight you can get to ground to be able to grow food through all the different layers. And there's whole books on how to design a food forest or an agroforestry system. And yes, I could go on and on about this for a long time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that detail. It's really interesting. I think the thing that can take from this, how you said there's millennia, if not thousands of years of practice and research, but it just seems like we're only just sort of scratching the surface in the Western or developed world as to how we could benefit as landscape architects and designers in incorporating these systems into our cities. So on that, congratulations, because you were awarded the Churchill Fellowship to pursue travel and study, to further study food forest systems overseas. So could you maybe provide the group just a bit of information as to what is the Churchill Fellowship, what it is you're investigating, where you're going to be going and taken to, and yeah, just a little bit of I guess inspiration for the group that one day that they could perhaps enter into that fellowship.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, the Churchill is an amazing opportunity. I'm very excited and humbled to have been awarded a fellowship last year. It allows people to travel overseas to study anything that they want, provided they can demonstrate that it brings benefit back to the Australian community. And it cannot be researched here in this country, and that you're the right person to be able to go and study it. So I'm looking to travel to 8 countries, not 8 countries, 8 projects over 8 weeks in 4 countries. Let me do another screen share. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. So if you go to the churchilltrust.com.au website, type in my name, you'll find my project.
Yeah.
So it's to investigate the potential of community food forests and orchards. Now, we have some community food forests and orchards in Australia, but they're not, most of them aren't as developed as the ones that have been happening overseas. So we're not far behind. I mean, the oldest ones, well, there's some very old ones that are sort of from the 1970s, but a lot of them only really came online in the last 20 years. So I'm looking to travel to the United States. I'm looking to travel to Seattle and visit a whole cluster of really great projects around the Seattle region, and then up into Vancouver in Canada, travelling over to Alberta, where there's a government program in Alberta for installing community food forests in one particular city in Alberta in Canada. Then I'm travelling down to, hopefully travelling down to Florida, to Miami, where there's a community food forest in schools program, where they've done 23 food forests in schools in Miami. Then I'll be talking and visiting some really key people in the United States and in Canada. And then hopefully travelling over to the United Kingdom and visiting some amazing projects over there. There's one organisation which has a £750,000 annual budget, promoting, installing and supporting community orchards right around the UK. I'm looking at an Agroforestry Trust project in Devon in England. And then finally, I'm looking to travel across to Italy to look at the Picasso Food Forest and meet Francesca Rioli, who's the driving force behind that project. So I need to brush up on my Italian. Yeah, and so that's what I'm looking to do. I'm looking to document these places, but I'm very interested in the back end of these places, how organisations raise money. Do they use exclusively volunteers, or do they have paid people? What's the governance like? What's their land tenure look like? All those sorts of things. The things we don't sort of see on a website, the back end of stuff, maybe the underbelly of these projects. What are the lessons learned? What can we learn from those great projects overseas? And so then I can take this information back and hopefully produce a handbook and get some pilot projects up and running in this country as well.
I think that would be amazing. Can't wait to see that.
Yeah, so we won't be travelling this year, I don't think, but I think we'll be travelling, fingers crossed, next year.
Great. Well, Gavin Hardy, thank you so much for your time. Super informative in terms of the students now having to be able to get a good idea as to these urban food systems that we've talked about in the lecture, and also inspirational, talking about the Churchill Fellowship, and then just sort of thinking from a perspective as to how we as designers and landscape architects can start to consider the urban realm and how we can incorporate some of these ideas in times of food security issues, food scarcity, food mile reduction. Thank you so much for your time today, Gavin.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk to you.